When I was growing up, there were plenty of live action shows that I really enjoyed. From Disney Channel to Nickelodeon, from Nasty Classified to Sweet Life of Zack and Cody to That's So Raven, all of these different shows, Zoe 101, I loved them. But when I think about it, in my adult years now, I'm 24, there's one show that I find myself going back to over and over again, and that show is Victorious. So, naturally, I wanted to do a video about Victorious. But when I started to formulate my idea for this video, I wanted it to center around the idea that Victorious is the best show that Nickelodeon ever created. But then I started to think, well, there's another show that I really enjoyed almost as much as Victorious that came out right before Victorious did, and that's iCarly. So I started thinking, well, what is it about Victorious that makes me continue to return to it? And then on the other hand, I have iCarly, which I have very fond memories of. I still remember watching the very first episode and busting up over a very cheesy line.
What were you thinking? Putting up a sign telling people to pee on Carl?
But for some reason, I don't find myself wanting to go back to iCarly. But I'm always watching, well, I'm not always watching Victorious, but I still watch it and I still enjoy it the same way. So I started to question myself and I started to try to figure out what it is about Victorious that makes me return to it versus iCarly, where I just have fond memories of. And after long deliberation, watching several episodes of both shows, I actually just got done watching the very first episode of the first 3 seasons of both shows, if that makes sense. So with iCarly, I watched the pilot. Victorious, I watched the pilot. iCarly, I watched the first episode of season 2. Victorious, I watched the first episode of season 2. iCarly, because the episodes are kind of out of order and they're not all there on Netflix, I wasn't able to watch the actual first episode of season 3, but I watched maybe the second or third episode. And then because it wasn't the first episode of iCarly season 3 with Victorious, instead of watching the first episode of season 3, I decided to watch the second episode of season 3, which happens to be one of my personal favorites. And I should also state that the episode of season 3 of iCarly that I watched was also a favorite of mine, or that I have fond memories of. So I tried to make it as fair and as balanced as I could, because going into it, admittedly, I did have a bias for Victorious. But anyway, after I watched 6 episodes in total, I came to the conclusion that even though the shows are so similar, they're both silly, they're both random, they both have characters that do outlandish and absurd things, there's one thing that sticks out about Victorious. Actually, there's several things, but there's one main thing that sticks out about Victorious, and that is that the characters overall have better development and they have better chemistry. Now, before people who love iCarly start hating, I love iCarly too, but what I'm saying is that overall, the chemistry between the characters and the overall growth and development and the effort put into the personalities of the characters in Victorious versus iCarly, Victorious wins. The characters of Victorious are just more flushed out when it comes down to it. And even though there are more characters you would expect, or yeah, they both have a lot of characters, but iCarly started off with the main 3, and then you have Spencer, and then, you know, side characters. But Victorious, you have Tori, Andre, Kat, Robbie, Beck, Jade. That's 6 main characters versus you can say 4 main characters with iCarly. So even though Victorious has more main characters, so there's more to balance out, they still somehow come across as more flushed out and more developed characters than the characters of iCarly. When I think of iCarly, I think of silly statements and or silly comments and, you know, a lot of screaming and just a lot of almost childish like comedy. And that's not to say that Victorious is without those elements, but there is something about the comedy of Victorious that seems just a little bit more mature. And when I return to it, I see more themes, more adult themes than I see in iCarly. And I think that's part of the reason that this show was able to still be appealing in your adult ages. If you started off watching this show when you were 14, like I did, versus when you were, I think when iCarly started, I was 11. So both of the shows came out when I was a little young, but the difference is that the comedy of iCarly stayed at that age, if that makes sense. It stayed at that 11-year-old age for me versus Victorious, where I feel like at 24, a lot of the jokes still are funny. It's just a different layer to them. And I still love super random, super strange comedy, but now I need just a little bit more from it. I need a little bit of context, and I need a little bit more subtlety with it. And I think that iCarly has more of a face value humor to it versus a show like Victorious. I'm not gonna sit here and try to say that Victorious is deep or that it has, jokes that have layer after layer after layer, but a lot of the jokes are more subtle. There is more comedy in the responses to things, if that makes sense. I actually sat down and made a Venn diagram to the best of my ability to try to compare and contrast the two shows. One conclusion that I arrived at is that Victorious has more of a observational comedy and iCarly has a situational comedy. And so what I mean by that is when I'm watching iCarly, I might see one of the characters do something that's just crazy and absurd. And not to say that Victorious won't do the same thing sometimes, but more often than not, the members or the characters in Victorious are responding to the type of activity that you'll find on an iCarly. And maybe me being older and now having seen The Office, and that's one of my favorite shows, you guys already know because I already did a video about that, I respond more to observational comedy. I respond more to the person that's responding to the strange activity. And I think you get a lot more of that with Victorious. And also, I think the characters in Victorious are just better actors in general. I'm not saying that anybody from iCarly is a bad actor, but I think that the acting in Victorious overall is much better and it sells more. I mean, I was trying to watch both shows and be as open as possible because, like I said, I went into it knowing that I have a preference. But when it comes down to it, I just laughed more when I watched Victorious versus iCarly. iCarly has more of a nostalgic appeal to me. Victorious is still funny to me. iCarly, I look at it and it's like when I go back in on Disney Plus and I watch That's So Raven. Like that show, don't get me wrong, I love it. I mean, That's So Raven, and I think it's the best live action Disney Channel show that they ever made. But a lot of the episodes, I'm watching it and I'm not laughing because it's funny to me now. I'm laughing because I can remember when I was younger watching it and how funny it was to me. And I'm laughing because nostalgia that I have for the show is so strong that those laughs almost are like a second nature. It's like, oh, I remember that. That was funny to me. But when I watch Victorious, it's still funny to me. The stuff that they say and the things that they do and the situations that they find themselves in is still a lot of slapstick. There are some jokes that I can look at and say, okay, yeah, that's not as funny as when I was younger. But for the most part, hearing these jokes at 24, they still make me laugh the same way I laughed when I was 14 watching this show. And so all that to say, Victorious is one of the best shows that Nickelodeon has ever did. The next show that I would say is underneath it or runner up would be Zoe 101 and then iCarly. And I know you're probably thinking now, well, why have you spent all this time comparing iCarly and Victorious if you're gonna say that Zoe 101 is second under Victorious? Well, because iCarly and Victorious have the most similarities, and because of that, I really questioned why I put Victorious over iCarly when iCarly came out first, and I almost fell in love with iCarly before Victorious. Overall, what I want to say is that Victorious is a really good show that appeals both to a young audience and to a more mature audience. And I think it really sucks that it wasn't given a proper ending. For whatever reason, there's a lot of speculation as to why the show came to the abrupt ending that it did. But I think the show had a lot of potential, and it's really sad that it ended the way that it did. iCarly went on for, I want to say, 6 seasons, 5 or 6 seasons, maybe 7. And Victorious only got 3, and it didn't even really get a proper last episode. But I really think that that show, had it gotten more seasons, it would be probably the best show that Nickelodeon ever created. And Nickelodeon has a lot of hit shows. Nasty Classified was one of my favorite shows when I was younger. And that show is another show that I return to, and I look at it, and a lot of the laughs are like second nature because I remember them being funny, but they also have a lot of jokes that are still genuinely funny to me. But overall, I think Victorious has the best shelf life, for lack of better words, when I think about Nickelodeon shows and just TV shows aimed at tweens in general, because that's what they're all aimed at, that 10 through 14 or something. It's in those middle years, like somewhere in middle school and somewhere in high school. It's like it's right in there. But I think Victorious does the best job of transcending those ages, and you can just watch it whenever. Me and my girlfriend are still put it on like we would put anything on, like we would put The Office on, or like we would put Arrested Development. Like, it's one of those things where, you in a movie Victorious? Yeah, but it's never iCarly. And so that really got me thinking, and that's really why I wanted to do this video. I wanted to say how much I really love Victorious and how much I think it's a great show, but I could not do that without examining why I think that, and I don't think the same thing about iCarly. Because like I say, I have fond memories of both, but only one of them still generally makes me laugh as an adult, and that's Victorious. And also, I think the Breakfast Club spoof that they did is just one of the most interesting concepts that I've ever seen from a children's show in general.
You just bought yourself another Saturday, mister.
Crushed. You just bought yourself another Saturday detention.
Did I get a good deal on it?
And that's not to say that other shows haven't done spoofs of movies and other shows, but it just, again, it's the chemistry between the characters, and it's the fact that they had characters that really did fit the general characters that movie presented. I think there are a couple more characters on Victorious than there were in the Breakfast Club, and they called themselves the Breakfast Bunch versus the Breakfast Club. But it was just good. Like, the comedy is there, and I don't know if both shows have the same writers, but the dialogue in Victorious seemed to be a little bit more interesting, for lack of better words. Like, when the characters talk to each other, I find that the comedy within the conversation comes across more naturally.
I don't see why we can't just pretend to be pirates.
I'll play pirates with you.
No, I don't like how you play pirates.
Like, characters in Victorious don't have to yell or make weird facial expressions, although they do sometimes. But iCarly, I feel like, relied on that a lot. It relied on loudness and relied on flandering and, you know, all of that extra stuff. And now that I'm older, I don't need that. I like subtlety. That's why I'm drawn to shows like, if you haven't seen it, Arrested Development, it's an old show. It's like the grandfather of the single camera shows. I know I talked about this before, but if you don't know what single camera shows are, it's like The Office, where it's not the 3-camera setup where you're on a sound stage. It's like the camera's following you around. You get that real world feel to it. Well, Arrested Development is like the grandfather of those shows. It was one of the first shows to use that approach, and it won a lot of awards, but it didn't do so well when it was actually on air. It's one of those shows that became more popular during its shelf life. But anyway, a lot of the comedy with that show was really subtle, and it's a lot of jokes that kind of build up throughout the seasons and callbacks. And I think Victorious has that same element. Again, I don't want to say that it's a subtle show. A lot of the comedy is face value, but it still has enough subtlety where in my adult ages, I feel like it still is appealing to me. So yeah, I don't know if this video is exactly what I intended for it to be, but those are my thoughts. Victorious, iCarly, yeah. So anyway, if you like this video, hit that like button for me. If you like this video, hit that share button for me. if you like this video, subscribe to my channel because it's about to blow up, and you know that already. Just stick around. I'm trying my best to be more thorough and do more research. For example, watching those 6 episodes. Sure, I didn't watch the entire series. Whatever. I did some research. I tried to come more prepared than I typically would, and so hopefully it shows in this video. And you know, yeah, so see you next time. I'ma spin out of here.